Thank you to the team at the Narrative Research Forum for inviting me to this lovely day of research insights. And thank you to all of you for taking some time out of your day to chat with me and to hear these findings that I'm about to share with you. I'd like to walk you through the ways in which we can uncover consumers' hidden narratives using techniques not traditionally used in the market research industry. So let's get right into it. And first, I want to start with a little bit of background. My name is Kristian Alomá. I am the founder and CEO of a research agency called Threadline. But really what I want to talk about is my background in psychology. Over the last 15 years or so, I have been pursuing, studying, and completed a PhD in psychology with a focus on consumer identity and a framework around a field of psychology known as narrative psychology. Now, I gathered all of those insights and put them together in my first book called Start with a Story, where I document these ideas and these insights in full. And one of the things that sort of stood out most in conducting this research when it comes to the field of psychology are the areas of interpersonal relationships and identity. Now, these are two areas that we talk about in psychology, and we also talk a great deal about in branding, marketing, and consumer research. Now, what is most interesting about these two areas is how they connect to each other, how we look at relationships and how we look at identity. And when we cross these two concepts, we get into an area that's known as the inclusion of the other into the self. Now, the inclusion of the other into the self is a concept in interpersonal relationships that looks at the way two individuals build and deepen their relationships. And what we see in the development of that relationship is that at the start of a relationship, when that relationship perhaps is still quite immature, there's very little overlap between the two individuals' identities. Now, as that relationship deepens, what we start to see is that relationships will integrate the other person into their own identity. So your significant other starts to feel a little bit like you essentially, right? Their celebrations, their anguish, their pain. You start to feel those as if they are yours and vice versa. To the point where you actually start to confuse the experiences with each other. You start to confuse your identities to some degree. And those identities become almost completely shared. And this is a natural sort of part of the way relationships develop and deepen. And this is essentially what many of us want for the brands that we work on, right? We want to court our consumers. We want to begin those relationships. We want to deepen those relationships. And the ways in which those relationships are built and the ways in which those relationships deepen can really sort of be partly explained through narrative psychology. When we look at narrative psychology as a track on which that relationships are built, we see that at the beginning of relationships, when people are just in courtship or when brands are just starting to talk to their consumers, we start to see that those stories that they share are relatively independent. I'm sharing my stories with you and you're sharing your stories with me. But as that relationship deepens, as we start to sort of build some relationship, even just a basic relationship, we start to see those stories begin to intertwine, where it's about relationships or stories that we've had together, experiences that we've had together. And as that relationship fully matures, we start to see where it's almost impossible to identify stories in our lives that don't include the other person. This is where that's that full inclusion of the other into the self, where our stories, the stories that we tell, include essentially that significant other. And what my work has done when I was doing my dissertation was looking at the ways those stories map over to the relationships we have with brands and how brands essentially sort of intersect with our own identity. And what I found was that they do, right? Over time, people start to integrate their most loved brands, their most used brands, the brands that they've had relationships with for the longest period of time, into their sense of self. And their stories start to match that. You start to hear them tell stories that includes the brands in those sort of supportive roles. Now, the reason we hear stories so clearly in this kind of work is that people make sense of their brands through the stories that feature them, right? We don't just identify brands for their features and their benefits and all of the different sort of traits that a brand has. We start to think about brands in the ways that they fit into our lives and the ways that we tell stories about those brands fitting into the things that we do, into the things that we want to accomplish, into the goals that we have. And while we are all likely very familiar with the jobs to be done framework, and a framework that is very helpful in understanding how people sort of make decisions and choices, I'd like to propose a new one that perhaps look a little bit deeper than just the jobs that are being done, but rather a framework based on those narratives. And I call it stories to be told. This framework focuses on how stories integrate into consumers' lives, in that consumers aren't just out there purchasing products and engaging with brands because of those benefits, because of those features. They're also purchasing them because of the stories they allow them to tell, the stories they allow them to tell about themselves, and the stories that they allow them to tell to others. This is at the heart of what I call the narrative economy. And the narrative economy is essentially built on the idea that people don't just buy brands because of what they do or even how it makes them feel, though those are important. People buy brands because of the stories they allow them to tell about themselves and they allow them to tell to others. As I mentioned, one of my areas of focus was in the field of narrative psychology. And narrative psychology is a subfield of psychology that focuses on how people reveal or use narrative structure to make sense of themselves and the world around them. This is an area that has gone back for many years and hasn't gotten as much of attention as other areas, but has really sort of helped us understand the way people make sense of the world as well as their own identity. And essentially what we see is a cycle where people do things that make sense based on the narratives that they've created, and then they create narratives that make sense of the things that they do. And this cycle continues. And if we do something new, we revise and adjust that narrative. And if something challenges that, well, we start to change our behavior as well. And so we see this cycle continue. And that cycle includes the brands in our lives. And yet with this understanding, we don't leverage these types of insights very often in the way that we conduct market research. We often talk about stories, right? The way brands can tell stories, the way we can communicate our insights through stories, but we don't look at the way stories help us understand people and who they are. Traditional research typically looks at interrogating essentially for answers, right? We've all been in those focus groups where we are just sort of battering away at the participant with question after question, attempting to understand what they really mean. And the problem is when we interrogate for questions, when we ask someone a question, they don't necessarily say the true thing. They say the right thing. Every time that we ask someone a question, they are simply essentially trying to navigate this sort of social environment, trying to provide a response that they think the moderator wants to hear. Now, sometimes that is true, but in many cases, they're just really sort of providing what they know that they think that person wants to hear from them. And so it's not always the true answer. Now, traditional research also typically asks our participants to predict what they would do in the future. Would they buy this? Are they intent on something like this? Are they interested in something like this? Now, human beings, psychology has shown us, are horrible at making predictions about the future. It is one of the things we are worst at. And yet, we repeatedly ask them to do so for us. So we are asking them to sort of answer questions that they really don't fully know how to answer. And we're asking them to essentially sort of predict a future that they are terrible at predicting. And the third thing that we do is we ask them to explain themselves, right? We push for those explanations of their behavior. Now, if anyone here has studied any area of behavioral economics, you've likely come across concepts of System 1 and System 2 thinking. And one of the core truths of System 1 and System 2 thinking is that System 2 doesn't really understand what System 1 is doing. And what that means is that when we ask someone to explain their behavior, they essentially don't really know, right? One of the most honest answers to why did you do that is often, I don't know. And so when we push for them to explain themselves, they're either trying to rationalize with System 2 what they're doing or explain in the best way they can something that they don't know anything about. Now, this is where I think narrative psychology can come into real benefit for the market research industry. When we look at research from a narrative lens, we see that we can actually start to shift the way we engage with these participants and, as a result, shift the way they respond to our prompts. For example, rather than just asking questions, we might instead elicit stories. Because when we get someone to tell us a story, they're no longer sort of tapping into the part of the brain that's looking for the right answer. Now they're tapping into the part of the brain that's just retelling a moment in their mind. And they're essentially just sort of narrating that moment to us as moderators. So they tell us more, they engage more, and they reveal more because they feel more comfortable telling that story. Stories also transcend the artificial. Rather than asking us to predict a future that we know nothing about, stories are essential to the way that we think, the way that we act, and the way that we behave. So when we tell stories, we essentially begin the process of making sense of our behavior, of analyzing our behavior. And stories are also the best predictors of the future because stories follow a track of time. So even though we can't fully predict the future, if we follow that storyline, we can sometimes begin to tell the possible endings to that story. And then finally, stories reveal greater relationships than questions ever would. Stories essentially help us track and understand the way different people and even the way different products or brands relate to the hero of that story. Where do we fit in? When do we fit in? What happens when we show up to the arc of that story? Understanding all of this helps us get a clear understanding of what our brand is really all about. So how do we do this? How do we move from interrogating questions to narrative prompts? I've got a few examples I'd like to share with you. Examples that I've done in my own work at Threadline. The first is from Airbnb. Now, if you don't know, Airbnb, of course, is the ability or the platform that allows you to book homes, apartments, cabins, and sometimes tree houses for yourself when it comes to travel. And we wanted to understand why consumers prefer Airbnbs over hotels and vice versa. And so we essentially recruited individuals who have participated or engaged in Airbnb platform, have booked stays in different Airbnb homes, as well as those that have booked at hotels as part of their travel experience. And we wanted to understand what is going on, why they chose an Airbnb, essentially. Now, traditional research would have us ask that very question. Why did you book an Airbnb? And if we were to ask participants this question, and we did as part of the study, we might hear responses that sound like this. Airbnbs are cheap and often just as conveniently located as hotels and have more amenities in the home itself. This is absolutely true, of course, but it's also something we could have all predicted about why people chose Airbnbs. It's something that we've probably experienced when we've chosen an Airbnb. But if we shift this question from being something that is sort of interrogating to something that prompts them to tell us a story, we might see a different kind of response. In fact, I know we will. So instead, rather than asking them to tell us why, we prompt them to tell us the story of their last Airbnb booking. Now, here's what will happen in a response to a prompt like this, is that rather than just a single answer like the one you saw on the previous slide, we will get a complete story from start to finish. We will hear about the different steps in that story and the process that they went through and the choices that they made and the options that they had available to them and who they brought into that decision-making process as well, and ultimately how they made that decision and how they felt about that. And part of that story, we might hear something like this. Airbnbs allow you to feel more immersed in the culture. Travel is about getting away, but hotels sanitize the experience so you feel like you could be anywhere. Now, as we see this quote, which is in the context of a broader story, we start to have a clear understanding of the role Airbnbs play in these travelers' lives, right? It's not just about having a place to stay within a culture. It's about having a way to immerse yourself in that culture, to know how someone in that culture lives, the stores that they go to, the shops that they visit, the kinds of meals that they cook, and essentially sort of the way that they live in that home. Whereas a hotel, which has its benefits, sanitizes that whole experience. So even though you may be in the farthest culture from your own home, you can go back to your hotel and feel like basically you're in the middle of Chicago because the hotel feels the same. Here's another example I want to share. And this one is from a startup that we worked with called LifeWeb 360. And LifeWeb 360 is a platform that allows those who have lost a loved one to share the news as well as to share stories of that loved one with a much broader audience via the internet. Now, the question that we had when we were doing this study for individuals who have engaged with this platform is, can you mourn a loved one virtually, digitally, and with dignity? Why did they turn to a platform like this? And what do they get from a platform like this when it comes to that very, very sort of a deep engraved moment of essentially mourning their loved one? Now, we talked to them about how that compares to sort of the traditional sort of mourning process, as well as, just using a platform like those provided by most funeral homes to communicate or to post about that loved one's life story. Now, in traditional research, we could have done what you often see, just sort of directly ask them, what did you get from using an online platform instead of doing it the traditional way? And in a question like that, we might hear the response, we couldn't travel because of the pandemic and needed a way to share the news of her passing. So it's basically a newsletter, right? A way to mass communicate to the world, to your loved ones, to family and friends near and far, that your loved one has passed away, and details about the services related to their death. Now, if we were to shift this question to a narrative lens, and rather than asking them to tell us about this platform versus another, we prompt them to tell us a story about how LifeWeb 360 compares to that story itself, about what it means to mourn someone. And in a story like this, we start to hear rich, meaningful, emotional stories about the role of that loved one in their lives and the role that a platform like this can play in helping them engage with the community around that loved one. And to a prompt like this, we hear wakes and memorials are for the rest of us, to share stories, to cry together, to laugh together. I needed a way to bring her community together no matter how far away they were. So we saw that a platform like LifeWeb 360 wasn't just about sharing the news, but about collecting stories. And it actually, what we heard from these stories allowed them to expand their sense of the relationship that they had with that loved one. It was no longer just my aunt. It was the woman who would go every week with her friend to cancer treatment, or the woman who belonged to the cultural center in the middle of Spain, or perhaps the woman who had a relationship with royalty in some far-flung country, right? We started to collect and hear these stories from these individuals and reveal the real role that this platform plays in their lives. And as you collect those stories, as you use an approach like this, a narrative approach, you'll start to see patterns across all of them. And in those patterns, what you want to do is to identify the elements of those master stories, right? Who is the hero? What are they doing? What are they like? How do they feel? What are their goals in that story? Every story has something that drives it forward. We want to understand what's happening, what's going on, and what are they trying to get? What is going on in that story? What actions are they taking? What steps are they going through? How does this story actually unfold? And then finally, what are the emotions related to each part of that story? An emotion for a brand is never a singular emotion. It's always a journey. And just as emotions shift through stories, they will shift in the stories that you hear about your brand. So I encourage you to think about and to leverage the field of narrative psychology to apply it to your own approach in research. Because one of the leading thinkers in narrative psychology tells us that I think is most relevant to market research, if you want to know me, then you must know my story, for my story defines who I am. Thank you so much, and I look forward to hearing your questions and comments.